The paramedic's voice cracked through the radio just as I was signing off my shift. Words tumbling over sirens and static. Mass casualty. Building collapse downtown. At least 15 victims. To critical inbound. My pen froze above the discharge summary. And the exhaustion that had been pulling my eyelids down evaporated as if someone had yanked the power cord out of my body, only to plug me back into the outlet of fear. When the stretcher burst through the doors, I saw them side by side. A mão esclotos catalogava designer labelizando outro cuja pele carregava a sujeira de muitas noites passadas no concreto frio. In Triage, a bank account should never matter. But the hospital director, standing behind me with his badge trembling with anxiety, made it painfully clear he disagreed, and that was when everything started to go off the rails, long before any monitor beeped. By the time the second ambulance screeched to a halt under the bay lights, the air in the already tasted like metal and antiseptic, thick with the anxious sweat of too many people pretending they were in control. The automatic doors kept opening and closing so fast that the motor's hum blended with the sound of the heart monitors, creating a kind of irregular beat that set the rhythm of that night. I could feel dried coffee on my tongue, the bitter film of a shift that should have ended an hour ago. But my hands were steady when the paramedics rushed the first stretcher toward me. Male, 60s, found under a concrete beam, hypertensive, GCS-6. Suspected internal bleeding, the paramedic fired off, and I barely registered the expensive watch cracked and hanging from his swollen wrist before my brain wrapped itself around the words that really mattered. Hypertensive, low Glasgow, time running out. The second stretcher came in seconds later, pushed by another team whose sneakers rang on the floor like someone clapping out of time, almost throwing off my focus. Male, 40s, unknown identity, was outside the building when the facade collapsed. Blunt trauma, open leg fracture, GCS-14, pressure holding for now, the EMT said, and this time my eyes went first to the face. His beard was ragged, more gray than black, with grime embedded in the strands as if soap had long ago stopped being a priority. His jacket was at least to sizes too big and smelled faintly of wet dog and cigarette smoke. He winced when they hit a small bump in the floor, a reflex sharply alive, and his hand clutched the side rail with the desperation of someone used to holding onto anything that kept him from falling all the way. I moved between the two stretchers, the fluorescent lights above me flickering just enough to turn everything into a sequence of frames instead of a continuous film. On my left, the monitor above the older man traced a fragile line of life, heart rate fast, pressure dangerously low, oxygen saturation dancing at the edge of acceptable, as if the numbers themselves were undecided about whether to keep going or give up. There was dried blood in his hair, pooling around a nasty scalp laceration, and bruising blooming across his chest in a pattern that whispered crushed ribs, internal bleeding before any imaging test could confirm. On my right, the homeless man, because there was no reason to pretend he was anything else, watched us with eyes that looked like they had seen a lot and believed in very little, except maybe in the immediate honesty of pain. Name, I asked the older man automatically, even knowing that with a Glasgow of 6, any answer would be a miracle. He groaned, a wet sound that came from somewhere deep, drowned by the rattle of his compromised lungs. His eyes opened for a moment, glazed, then slipped away again as if the effort of coming back to the surface was too much. "He's Mr. Weston," a nurse supplied, her voice tense, while she pushed a cart of instruments to my side. "Arthur Weston. The Weston Foundation. They sponsor the new cardiac wing." The words landed in the air like something flammable, and I felt the atmosphere around me change, almost imperceptibly, like when the temperature drops a degree but your body knows something changed. I turned to the other stretcher and saw the paramedic adjusting the oxygen mask on the homeless man's face, his latex gloves squeaking softly against the plastic. "Do you know your name, sir?" I asked, trying to keep a neutral tone. without that condescending compassion so many use as a shield when they look at someone who has lost almost everything. His eyes met mine with a brief surprise, like no one had asked that question in a long time. "Eli," he said, the word grated as if it hadn't been used often. "Utilitarianism. I was just passing by, man, I swear." The building, his voice broke, not into crying, but into a kind of nervous laugh that I'd heard many times in trauma scenes. The mind trying to turn horror into a bad joke so it doesn't completely fall apart. There is a moment in every mass casualty situation when the noise of the room seems to recede to steps, giving space for something much older and instinctive to take over. As I studied the two of them side by side, my training ran its cold algorithm in the back of my mind: airway, breathing, circulation, disability, exposure, vital signs, injury severity, likelihood of survival. Weston's abdomen was distended and rigid under my palpation, his pulse thready, his skin cold and clammy despite the warmth of the classic signs of internal hemorrhage that would need a surgical team and an operating room ready in minutes, not in half an hour. Eli, though battered, had vital signs that looked almost indecently good by comparison. His blood pressure was stable, his breathing labored but effective, his eyes tracking my every move with a suspicion that bordered on survival instinct. "Doctor, we have only one OR ready," the charge nurse said, her voice low but firm, as if she herself were trying to keep the panic in a straight line. "The other one is still being prepped from the last emergency, and anesthesia is tied up. We can stabilize one and take to surgery, but the other will have to wait." The sentence hung between us like a sentence of luck, not of science. I heard the hiss of a ventilator coming from the room next door, the sound of a gurney being yanked along in a hurry by an intern. And for a second I thought about how many times I'd talked about limited resources in committee meetings without feeling firsthand the weight of an only one quite this literal. It was then that I felt, more than I heard, the presence of the hospital director drawing closer. His expensive cologne battling the smell of chlorhexidine that saturated the Calum, he called, without raising his voice much, but in a way that cut through the racket around me, as if he had an exclusive audio channel to my brain. I didn't look up immediately. I pressed gently on Weston's abdomen again, watchful of the way his blood pressure dropped a little more on the monitor, while Eli clenched his teeth as the nurse adjusted the splint on his fractured leg. Triage first, politics after, I thought, but even my own mantra started to sound fragile inside my head. "We need Weston in the OR," the director said, finally moving close enough for me to see the reflection of the emergency lights in his glasses. "He's important to this hospital. You know what his donations mean. We can't lose him." The subtext didn't need to be translated. It wasn't just about a life. It was about entire wings, state-of-the-art equipment, scholarships for residents, a cascade of advantages that came packaged in the Weston name. Beside him, Eli took a deep breath, as if the air had also gotten heavier for him, even without knowing who that man in the expensive suit was demanding priority. I could feel my jaw tightening. That old reflex of resistance I thought I'd tamed after years of dealing with protocols and ethics committees that, in practice, were rarely consulted at the speed of chaos. "We're still assessing," I said, finally looking directly at the director, letting him see the exhaustion in my eyes, but not hesitation. "Right now, he's unstable, and his prognosis is poor, even with surgery. The other patient has higher chances if we move fast." I didn't point at Eli. I didn't want to turn him into a prop, but the director followed my gaze and frowned, as if the mere sight of someone in torn clothes occupying a clean stretcher were an offense to the hospital's aesthetics. "He is a homeless man, Calum," the director said, without even trying to lower his voice this time. And the word homeless fell over Eli's bed like an indelible ink mark, something that defined more than any lab test. Weston's contributions could fund this 4 years, could expand our trauma unit, could save dozens, maybe hundreds of lives. Think about the greater good, the phrase, wrapped in a veneer of elegant utilitarianism, carried an urgency that had nothing to do with Weston's bleeding and everything to do with donors' dinners. Capital campaigns, the financial balance of an institution that lived on a strange boundary between philanthropy and business. Eli looked away, as if he was used to people deciding for him, not with him. But even so, I saw the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. A microgesture of someone who just heard his own life reduced to a footnote in someone else's argument. "Doc," he murmured, the word muffled by the oxygen mask. "If you gotta give that fancy room to the rich guy, I get it. Been last in line my whole damn life." There was no drama in his voice, no attempt to martyr himself. Just a solid, settled weariness that made more noise in my chest than any tachycardia. Alarm! I swallowed, feeling the back of my throat burn, not from cheap emotion, but from that corrosive mix of adrenaline and indignation the body doesn't quite know where to store. In medical school, triage had been taught to us like a clean algorithm, an orderly sequence of decisions based on probabilities and physiology, not on last names and donation histories. Standing there, with 2 lives hanging by the thread of scarce resources, I realized that no one had really prepared us for the moment when the hospital itself would lean over your shoulder and try to tilt the scales. And as the clock on the wall ticked toward the point of no return, I knew that whatever choice I made wouldn't stay in that room. It would echo through the corridors, through the reports, through the fundraising dinners, and, especially, inside me, long after the monitors fell silent. The fluorescent lights above the trauma bay seemed to pulse with the same frantic rhythm as Weston's heart monitor, each beep growing more erratic, pulling me back from the sterile logic of triage into the raw chaos of flesh and blood refusing to cooperate. I watched the numbers on his screen slide, inexorably downward, blood pressure dipping into the 70s systolic. Oxygen saturation hovering at 88% despite the hissing non-rebreather mask. His abdomen now taut like a drum under the thin sheet. Every palpation eliciting a faint groan that spoke of peritoneum soaked in blood. Eli, on the adjacent stretcher, had started to shift restlessly, his good leg kicking against the restraints as the morphine wore off, his fractured femur protruding through torn denim in a way that made even the most jaded nurses avert their eyes. His face, slick with sweat, twisted into a grimace that mixed pain with something deeper. A dawning realization that he was the outsider in this equation of lives. Push 2 units of ONEG, stat, and get a fast ultrasound. I barked at the resident hovering nearby, my voice cutting through the rising din of pages and shouted orders, while the charged nurse relayed the call to the OR. Her words clipped with urgency that betrayed the bottleneck we all knew was coming. The air thickened with the metallic tongue of blood and the sharp bite of alcohol wipes as we cut away. Weston's blood-soaked Armani shirt, revealing a constellation of bruises across his chest that screamed rib fractures. Possible cardiac tamponade, a body betraying its owner in slow motion. Beside us, the director, Dr. Hargrove, impeccably suited even at 2 a.m. leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear as he muttered, "Calum, the board will have my head if we lose him." His foundation wired $8 million last quarter for the new MRI suite. Think of the patients that machine will save. Eli's eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted between us, catching fragments of the conversation like shards of glass. He wasn't deaf to the subtext, the way Hargrove's voice dripped with calculation, turning a man's life into ledger entries. "Hey, Doc, if it's me or him, just do what you gotta," Eli rasped, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. But the tremor in it hit me harder than any code blue alarm. A lifetime of being invisible now, distilled into this one plea not to be collateral damage. The ultrasound probe glided over Weston's belly, revealing Quasimo peritoneo. No question, and the room seemed to contract, every pair of hands moving faster, IVS clanging, monitors shrieking as his pressure tanked further, forcing us into a rhythm of desperation where seconds felt like surgical incisions. The team fragmented under the pressure, residents glancing at me for cues, while nurses exchanged loaded looks. The kind that said they'd seen administrators override clinical judgment before, turning healers into gatekeepers. One young intern even paused mid-chest compression prep, whispering to another, "Weston's the whale donor, losing him tanks our budget." Hargrove seized the moment, stepping into the fray with the confidence of someone who signed paychecks, his hand clamping my shoulder like a vice. "Eli can wait in stabilization. We've got fluids. Presses he's young, he'll hold. Weston needs the knife now, or we lose a pillar of this institution." His words landed amid the beeps and gasps, igniting murmurs from the staff. Some nodding in reluctant agreement, others staring at the floor. The ethical fault line cracking open right there in the trauma bay. Eli's monitor chimed a warning, his heart rate spiking into the 130s from pain. His blood pressure holding, but his respiration shallow, ragged, as if his body sensed the invisible scale tipping against him. I felt a cold sweat break on my forehead, the weight of 18 hours on my feet, now compounded by this moral vice, where saving the man with the best odds meant defying the man with the deepest pockets. "Director, triage isn't an auction," I said, low enough for only him to hear, but loud enough to steady my own resolve, as we wheeled Weston towards stabilization, his groans fading into the ether while Eli's eyes locked on mine, pleading silently for the medicine I'd sworn to practice, not the politics it had become entangled in. Standing at the nexus of two stretchers, with the OR door looming like a guillotine at the end of the hall, I felt the algorithm of triage collide head-on with the reality of human consequence. Every vital sign reading now tainted by the shadow of dollar signs and donor plaques. Weston lay pallid and still in stabilization bay 2, his central line pumping norepinephrine at max dose. The echo of his weak pulse thumping through the arterial line like a countdown. While Eli's leg was splinted, but his face etched with the quiet terror of someone who knew waiting often meant dying forgotten. Hargrove paced beside me, phone already buzzing with incoming calls from the Foundation's lawyers, no doubt. His voice, a relentless drumbeat. "Calum. Picture it, the cardiac wing named after him, ventilators for the NICU, scholarships for residents like you once were. One life now for dozens later. That's utilitarianism. That's medicine in the real world." The ethics committee handbook burned in my mind. Pages of protocols drilled into us during fellowship. Start triage. Simple triage and rapid treatment, respiratory rate, perfusion, mental status. Walking wounded last but nowhere. Did it mention boardroom pressures or the fact that hospitals ran on philanthropy as much as for fluids? I glanced at Eli, who had fallen into a morphine-induced doze, his chest rising and falling with deceptive steadiness. His open fracture debrided, but screaming for definitive repair before compartment syndrome set in. His odds at 80% survival with surgery versus 40% if delayed. Weston's fast confirmed massive hemiperitoneum. Likely splenic rupture, but his age, comorbidities hinted at in his chart, hypertension. Prior me dropped his odds to under 30%, even with the scalpel. Yet Hargrove saw not a patient, but a balance sheet teetering on the edge. Nurses hovered at the periphery, their silence louder than any protest. One veterinar, and shooting me a look that said she'd covered for boulder calls before, while a newer one fidgeted with her stethoscope, whispering about lawsuits if we let the big donor go. The surgeon on call, Dr. Patel, appeared at the OR door, masked and gowned, his eyes questioning over the sterile field. "Who's coming in?" "Anesthesia's ready, but we've got one table." That question hung like smoke, forcing me to articulate the impossible, prioritize the probable survivor or the probable benefactor. My hands clenching the chart until the edges crumpled, the scent of his blood still clinging to my gloves. In that suspended moment, flashes of past dilemmas assaulted me, the uninsured addict I'd tubed over a soccer mom during flu surge. The backlash from her husband as he Facebook tirade the quiet vindication when the addict walked out days later. Or the chemio administration on a transplant list tweak, waking for months with the taste of compromise sour on my tongue. Hargrove sensed my hesitation, leaning in with paternal menace. This isn't just about tonight, Calum. Lose Weston, and next year's budget gets slashed, fewer beds, longer waits, patients like Eli suffering more in the long run. Be the hero for one, or the steward for many, his logic twisted like a scalpel in soft tissue. Appealing to the greater good, while ignoring that true utility demanded blind justice, not weighted scales. Eli stirred then, mumbling through cracked lips, Don't let him by my spot, Doc. I ain't worth no MRI machine, his words slurring but piercing, stripping away the abstractions to reveal the man beneath father once. Maybe, brother, human with dreams eroded by circumstance, now reduced to a probability percentage in a war of resources. I met Hargrove's gaze, seeing not a villain but a man trapped in the same system, balancing lives against ledgers, and realized the dilemma wasn't his or mine alone, but the fracture line in American healthcare itself, where Hippocrates met spreadsheets, and the oath to do no harm blurred under financial hemorrhage. The OR doors hissed open like a final judgment, the sterile chill wafting out to meet the humid desperation of the trauma bay. And in that breath, I made the call that would carve my career in two. Take Eli Turner to OR1, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest, pointing to the stretcher with the splinted leg and the man who'd already been written off by circumstance long before the building fell. The team froze for a split second, Patel's eyes widening above his mask. Nurses exchanging glances sharp as lancets, Hargrove's face draining of color as if I'd slapped him, then motion exploded, wheels rolling. For poles rattling, the symphony of urgency redirecting toward the improbable survivor. Calum, what the hell? Hargrove exploded, stepping in front of Eli's stretcher, his arms out as if to physically block the procession, voice rising to pierce the din. Weston's crashing pressure 60/OE palp, lacto-oitu. You're condemning him for this. He gestured wildly at Eli, who blinked up confused through the pain fog, unaware he'd just become the fulcrum of institutional Armageddon. I sidestepped, keeping pace with my hand on Eli's shoulder anchor. Tritrotar direct. Eli's revised trauma score is 7.5, 80% survival with surgery. Weston's RTS for 0.2, under 30%. Resources to the viable patient that start, that's SALT. That's every mass casualty guideline since '92. They wheeled Eli through the doors. The scrub tech calling back femur ORIF and exploration stat, anesthesia confirming IO access. The promise of light and scalpels offering him a fighting chance he'd never bought with donations. Back in stabilization, Weston's team swarmed transfusion after transfusion. FAST repeated, showing worsening free fluid, his rhythm slipping into sinus tach, then ectopy. The crash cart looming like a sentinel as we bought minutes with pressers and prayers. Hargrove followed me, phone to ear, now yelling at the chief of staff. He's sending the homeless guy to surgery while our biggest donor bleeds. Out, get ethics down here now. His betrayal stung, but I felt a clarity amid the chaos. The oath crystallizing. First, do no harm to the principle that all lives weigh equal under the stethoscope. The waiting stretched taut as a vent hose. Minutes bleeding into agony while I split time between bays. Eli's pre-op, vital stabilizing under sedation. Weston's deteriorating despite everything, intubation for airway protection. His chest blooming purple under rib fractures we couldn't fix without a table. A foundation rep bursting, designer coat askewed, Dumois in surgery. Do his? Her hysteria mirroring Hargrove's, turning the bay into a circus of privilege clashing with protocol. I stood firm, reciting scores, probabilities, the cold math of survival that no amount of money could rewrite. Even as guilt gnawed, was I saving one or dooming the system that saved thousands? Then the call from OR. Patient stable on table, femur repaired. No major vascular injury, good call. Doc. Relief flooded me, bitter with the counterpoint from stabilization. Weston coding VFIB. Shocking. Paddles thumped, amio pushed, but his heart, starved of volume and time, fibrillated into silence. The line flatlining as the team stepped back, defeated. Hargrove glared, mouthing, "You'll regret this," but in that apex of pressure. With Eli's life reclaimed and Weston's lost to odds not dollars, I knew I'd chosen the physician over the politician. The silence after the code was the heaviest thing in the room, thicker than the blood bags, now discarded around Weston's still form. The defibrillator pads peeled away like failed promises. His chest no longer rising under the drape as the pronouncement time was noted, 3:47 a.m. The team dispersed in slow motion, nurses wiping faces streaked with sweat and unspoken questions. The resident avoiding my eyes as he updated the chart, while Hargrove stormed out phone in hand, already scripting the damage control for morning rounds. Eli emerged from recovery hours later, groggy under fentanyl PCA. His leg immobilized in external fixator, color returning to cheeks that had kissed death. He gripped my hand weakly, murmuring, You picked me. Why?" His confusion a mirror to the miracle of being seen. Words spread through shifts, like IV contrast. Whispers in break rooms about the triage that tanked the donor. Some nurses clapping my back in quiet solidarity. Others murmuring about budget cuts looming now that Weston's foundation vowed to pull support. The rep returned with his widow, elegant even in grief, her voice breaking as she asked, "Couldn't you have done more?" "He built half this hospital." I explained the math again, RTS, survival curves. Resource allocation, but her eyes glazed with loss, seeing conspiracy where there was cruel chance, leaving with a handshake that felt like a subpoena. Eli, overhearing from his bed, just nodded slowly. "Rich guy gone, poor guy lives. World's funny that way. Doc. Thanks for not laughing me off the stretcher." Hargrove summoned me to his office at dawn. The city skyline mocking through windows as he slid a preliminary ethics review notice across the desk. "You defied direct guidance in a resource crisis. Board meeting tomorrow, expect suspension pending investigation." His tone mixed anger with exhaustion. The man who'd fought for expansions, now facing contraction because one doctor clung to protocol over pragmatism. I left without argument, the weight settling like post-call fatigue. Gnawing. Eli's discharge papers would read full recovery anticipated, while Weston's file closed with expired despite aggressive. Resuscitation back on the floor. Eli's family trickled in a sister with tear-streaked makeup. Kids wide-eyed at the sterile wonder hugging him tentatively around tubes and rails, their gratitude a bomb against the institutional frost. "Heard what you did," the sister said, squeezing my arm. "Gave my brother a shot when no one else would," in that human connection. Amid the beeps and bleach, the storm quieted. Loss and life coexisting in uneasy truce. The hospital exhaling after holding its breath. Weeks later, driving home through rain-slicked streets, the wipers beating time like persistent heart monitors. I still felt the ghost pressure of that night on my palms, the yield of Weston's abdomen. The grip of Eli's, hand reminders that triage scars deeper than scalpels ever could. The board cleared me after review, citing adherence to published guidelines, but Hargrove's chill lingered in meetings. Funding dried up as promised, forcing cuts to elective procedures and staff hours. A ripple of my choice echoing in empty beds and overtime denials. Eli walked out on crutches last month, pausing at the doors to wave. A nondescript man reclaiming the sidewalk. His survival a quiet rebuke to the system that nearly triaged him last by default. I wonder sometimes, staring at the donor wall where Weston's name will never be etched, if utilitarianism wears a white coat or a suit. If saving the probable means damning the probable donors who make saving possible at scale. That night taught me medicine's true scalpel isn't steel, but choice. Carving away illusions of neutrality in a world where resources are rationed not by need alone, but by noise and net worth. Yet in the quiet after storms, when monitors hush and masks fall, there's dignity in remembering every heartbeat, he, she, or ragged demands the same blind chance. And some battles worth fighting leave you standing, bloodied but unbowed, with the knowledge that you treated patients, not portfolios. Eli sent a card once, scrawled in shaky pen. "Owe you a beer when this leg's good. First time someone bet on me. I keep it in my locker, a talisman against compromise, proof that in the hospital's unblinking glare, one ethical stand can mend what money merely maintains. The scar aches on tough shifts, but it's the mark of a physician who chose souls over spreadsheets. And in that ache lies the poetry of why we endure the beeps, the blood, the impossible calls,